soaks the cracks in the road. My head is stained glass, my hands are stained glass, the whole world is stained glass tonight. Bum, ba-da-ba-da-bum, bum, ba-ba-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-dum, bum, bum. And if my body is a temple, then this ruin is a mess, full of mossy cobblestone, second-hand smoking teenage jealousy. Bum, ba-da-ba-da-bum, bum, ba-ba-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-dum, bum, bum. My hands are like a river when you said please stay for tea. I didn't see a word for this at 18, but I'm so proud of you. Your fat looks lovely, so lovely, so lovely, so lovely. And I'll promptly crash my car as soon as I can drive the car. And God knows I'll live forever when I be a 10. And I'll keep the choir in my passenger seat, and we'll break down in harmony. I'll take you home as soon as I have wheels more stable than a skateboard.
You alright?
Hello! Hi, chat! How are y'all doing today? We're gonna be reading the last 2 chapters of Under the Brine today. A little bit earlier than yesterday, mainly because I know that if y'all EST watchers don't want to fall asleep or something, I mean, if you fall asleep to my stream, I'm not offended by it. I also just wanted to do it earlier so I'm not as tired near the end. Anyway, if any of you are new to the stream, be sure to leave a follow, because at 150 followers I'm going to be doing a stream entirely in a British accent. So I'm setting myself up for humiliation here, but we'll see. Alright. So I'm gonna try and do a quick summary of what's been happening in the past couple chapters. This fanfiction is a lot shorter. It's only 4 chapters. I read the first 2 yesterday, and now I'm gonna read the last 2 today. So basically what's happened is Wilbur found a dead body wash up on the shore of the beach, and over time he's starting to realize that he knew, at first he didn't recognize the body, but over time he started getting brain fog of things that were odd feelings, like a playlist that he didn't remember having on Spotify. I think it's Spotify. Feeling like his apartment was emptier than it normally is, even though he supposedly lives alone. And then he started having dreams about the dead body, saying that he wasn't actually dead and that he needs to go to the train tracks to know who that person was. So I think that's what's going to happen at the start of this chapter. So let's get started. By the way, this is by Bones and the Bees, so be sure to support them in any way possible, because they're the writer that wrote Tommy and Its Clinic for Supervillains. And if you were there for me reading that, or if you've read it yourself, you'll know how really well written their works are. Alright. Chapter 3. Train Cars. Summary. Wilbur finds the shoebox. There's no trigger warnings, so let's keep going. When Wilbur woke up, he knew he had a choice. He could either ignore the dream and go about his day, taking the pills again and pretending he couldn't feel the eyes watching him. Or he could listen to the dream. Listen to the dead boy telling him to go to the train tracks. Believe in the impossible and hope that somehow this wild goose chase gave him the answers he so desperately craved. When Wilbur found himself putting his morning coffee in a travel mug, that's when he'd realized he already made his decision. It was harder than usual to wade through the fog this morning. His mind kept getting off track, thoughts of work and traffic and other mundane things distracting him from what he was trying to do. He paused a few times as he got dressed, questioning what he was doing, but then he'd remember the tears rolling down the boy's cheeks and would hear his voice telling him to go to the train tracks. Wilbur struggled to ignore the empty passenger seat as he drove to the edge of town. He turned on that playlist he couldn't remember making, finding himself mouthing the lyrics to songs he couldn't remember hearing before. The coffee in his mug was bitter on his tongue, and he focused on that sharpness, clinging to it as he tried to keep himself from drowning in his disoriented thoughts. It wasn't hard to find the dirt turn off that led to the tracks. Wilbur had made this drive thousands of times as a teenager, and it was still ingrained in his memory many years later. The sky above was swollen with dark clouds, the promise of rain hanging heavily over his head. When he spotted the first rusted train car, he pulled the car to a stop. Cutting the engine, the song Wilbur had been humming along to cut off as well, and the resulting silence was almost suffocating in how much it weighed down his shoulders. He stepped out of the car, his boots squishing against overgrown green grass. The coffee mug in his hand was like a lifeline, the sharp taste reminding him of why he was there every time he felt himself starting to drift. Except the more he walked, the less he felt he needed the coffee. The fog was clearing itself from his head for the first time in days, and with every step forward, it was less and less difficult to focus on what he was doing. Dark weeds and vibrant wildflowers poked between the metal tracks that had long since been abandoned. Wilbur passed an overturned train car, eyeing the way the rust had eaten away at the metal over the decades. He hopped onto the tracks themselves, balancing with his arms out like he was 15 again, trying to walk across the rails without ever touching the grass. A raindrop landed on his head. Wilbur glanced up to see the clouds swirling like a rolling ocean. It was probably going to start pouring any minute now. The tugging in his chest was back. Wilbur tried not to think too hard about where he was going, instead letting the tugging sensation pull him forward. He was far enough away from the forest now that he didn't feel the eyes watching him for the first time in days, and the relief of that alone was enough to make him want to cry. But he held it together, because he was here for a reason. His feet seemed to know where he needed to go, because soon enough, he was standing in front of a rather indistinct freight car he would have never noticed on his own. The door was open to the car on both sides. Hold on, when did the music stop? Okay, we're good. There's just a little bit of lag. Wilbur could see through the grassy meadow behind the tracks, noticing the long weeds poking their dark heads out, reaching for the rain that was starting to come down in a gentle pitter-patter. Wilbur hopped up into the train car, grunting when his knees slammed against the metal floor. He remembered all the times he'd done this as a teenager, sneaking out here with Quackity, Sapnap, Carl, Tina, and just about everyone else that they were on friendly terms with. No single friend group owned the train tracks. It was something that united the entire student body, where they would all swap joints and cigarettes like candy, passing around bottles of rum swiped from parents' liquor cabinets, ignoring the way the spiced brown liquid sat heavily in their stomachs in favor of pretending like they were drunker than they were. The inside of the train car still had some wooden crates inside of it from a delivery that never reached its destination. Pushing to his feet, Wilbur turned on his phone flashlight as he ducked towards the back corner where the faint light from outside didn't reach, eyes skimming around for any kind of shoebox. At first, he didn't see anything and almost turned around. But then, something glinted off the light from his phone, and Wilbur paused to take a closer look. Hidden behind one of the wooden crates in the very back of the car, Wilbur saw a shard of glass on the ground. Then, he noticed a blanket, and when he stepped closer, he noticed an entire nook hidden behind the crates like the kind of place a homeless person might hole up to stay the night. Deja vu washed over him as he looked over the makeshift bed. There was no sign of anyone having been there recently. The blanket was dark and disheveled, and Wilbur noticed a few pieces of trash strewn around, candy wrappers and an empty bag of chips. Kneeling down, Wilbur patted the blanket. It was surprisingly clean for sitting in an abandoned train car, and felt his hand hit something square. Reaching under the fabric, Wilbur pulled out a pack of cigarettes. His stomach clenched when he recognized it as his favorite brand. Pocketing the cigarettes, Wilbur pulled the rest of the blanket away. His breath caught in his throat when he spotted it. Sure enough, underneath the blanket there was a black shoebox for the same brand of boots Wilbur was wearing right now. Reaching out, he tugged the shoebox over and heard several things shift inside of it. His heart was pounding in his chest. He lifted the shoebox, carrying it to the back door to the train car so he could look at the contents in the daylight. Sitting down with his feet hanging over the edge of the train car door, Wilbur could hear the rain steadily thrumming against the metal roof. He stared at the shoebox, hands shaking as he prepared to flip the lid off, and the boy's words echoed in his ears. It might help, it might not, but it's the only thing I can think of. This might give Wilbur the answers he was so desperate for. It might tell him why there was an empty space in his chest, a yawning cavern nagging at him like an open wound. Or it might not give him anything. This might just be a shoebox full of junk and Wilbur would be right back where he started. There was only one way to find out. Taking a deep breath, Wilbur flipped open the shoebox lid. There were pictures inside, Polaroids that looked like the same kind of film Wilbur had for his old Polaroid camera back at his apartment. He lifted one up, and his heart leapt into his throat. It was a picture of him. It looked like he was sitting in the train car, bright sunshine making the grass on the other side of the car glow behind him. In the picture, Wilbur was smiling widely, but that wasn't what surprised Wilbur the most. No, it was that Wilbur had his arm wrapped around someone in the picture. He had to blink a few times to make his eyes focus on the second face in the picture, but when he finally got his vision to stop blurring, he found himself staring into familiar gray-blue eyes. It was the boy. His cheeks were rosy, and there was no seaweed in his hair as he beamed at the camera. He was leaning into Wilbur's side, Wilbur tugging him close with a kind of familiarity that suggested this was a normal thing between them. The next picture was similar. The boy seemed to have taken this one, making some kind of overdramatic pouty face as Wilbur gave the camera a flat stare, like he was annoyed about something. But Wilbur could see the Lumi, thank you for the raid! How was your stream? I'm reading, oh! Wait, did it show up? Did it actually show up? Oh, okay. Well, there was a little ghost of it, but not the actual message. I still gotta fix that somehow. God damn it. I thought I fixed it. Anyway, thank you for the raid. How was your stream? I asked that already. God damn it. But if you're familiar with the fanfiction Tommy and Its Clinic for Supervillains, I am... there's a small, like a shorter story called Under the Brine, written by the same author. Anyway, I don't know if the one viewer was you or if this is a different viewer, but if you're new to my stream, be sure to leave a follow. Because when I reach 150 followers, I'm gonna be doing an entire stream in a British accent. So that's gonna be fun. Let's see, where was I? I'll just start from the beginning of this paragraph. The next picture was similar. The boy seemed to have taken this one, making some kind of overdramatic pouty face as Wilbur gave the camera a flat stare, like he was annoyed about something. But Wilbur could see the mirth dancing in his own dark eyes, and could tell he hadn't actually been as upset as his face would suggest. That was a picture just of Wilbur, once again giving the camera a flat stare with something that looked like a milkshake spilled down the front of his shirt. There was a hand stretched out in front of the camera as well, flipping Wilbur off, and Wilbur guessed the boy had taken the picture. Oh, there was a picture just of Wilbur. Okay, there we go. The last picture was just of the boy. He looked like he had fallen asleep in the grass in the meadow, his face framed by the green fronds and small white flowers. It would have been a peaceful picture if not for the giant baby man written across his forehead in black marker. Wilbur had a feeling he took that picture. The more Wilbur's eyes skimmed over these pictures, the more his throat threatened to close up on him. He didn't remember taking these, but the proof was in front of his eyes. The boy was right. Wilbur had known him, and somehow had forgotten him. Swallowing down the bile rising in his throat, Wilbur looked past the pictures in his hands and noticed something else in the shoebox. It was a necklace. Situated on a silver chain, Wilbur saw a small pendant in the shape of a crown. As Wilbur picked it up and dropped the crown in his palm, he ran his thumb over the silver metal, feeling the warmth humming under its surface. Suddenly, a memory flashed in his mind. "Wilbur, look what I found!" They were on the beach, and the sky was quickly shifting to a deep purple color as dusk neared its end. Seagulls cawed overhead, the forest looming over them in the distance. Wilbur's boots squished against the damp sand. His hands were shoved into his pockets, fingers wrapped around his car keys as they prepared to leave. The sea breeze whipped his hair around his head, and he had to bring a hand up to push his curls back to see what the boy was holding. "What is it?" "It's a necklace," the boy said, holding up the crown necklace. The pendant was covered in sand, and the boy quickly crouched down to dip it in the water before straightening back up. Salt water dripped from the metal. The boy was holding it up proudly, like he had won a prize. "Did you just find that in the sand?" Wilbur asked, narrowing his eyes as the boy pulled the necklace back. "Yep. Guess it washed up on the beach," the boy said, wrapping his fingers around the chain. "I can keep it, right, Wilbur?" Wilbur snorted. "I mean, if it washed up from the ocean, I doubt anyone's looking for it. So yeah, you can keep it, Tommy." The boy, Tommy, grinned and shoved it into his jean pocket. "Fuck yeah! Aren't you going to wear it?" Wilbur asked, raising an eyebrow. Tommy shook his head. "Nah, I'm not much of a necklace man myself. Not part of my aesthetic. But I'll put it in the memory box we have next time we go to the tracks." "It's aesthetic, Tommy, not aesthetic," Wilbur corrected, slinging an arm around Tommy's shoulders as he turned to head towards the parking lot. "Don't care. I'm saying aesthetic because it's funnier," Tommy shot back, leaning into Wilbur's side as they walked. Wilbur laughed, with fondness warming his chest. Blinking out of the memory, Wilbur startled when he saw the pendant in the palm of his hand once again. Tommy. The boy's name was Tommy. For a moment, Wilbur waited, as if remembering the boy's name meant all of his apparent missing memories were going to rush back all at once. That didn't happen, though. The only piece he had was still just the memory at that beach. He slipped the necklace over his head before putting the pictures back in the shoebox. His heart was pounding in his chest as he pushed to his feet, holding onto the shoebox for dear life as he hopped out of the train and back onto the tracks. Fat, icy raindrops fell onto his head. One particularly large raindrop ran down his back, and Wilbur shuddered, but he had a feeling it wasn't from the cold. He'd forgotten Tommy. Clearly, Tommy was important to him, and Wilbur had forgotten everything about him. Wilbur wasn't sure if he wanted to laugh or cry. Laugh because he'd finally found out what was missing, or cry because now he knew why it felt like there was a hole where his chest should be. Grief. He was grieving Tommy and hadn't even known it. As he walked away from the train car, another memory flashed in his mind. "Holy shit, Will! This thing is so cool!" Tommy exclaimed, climbing into the car with a heaving grunt. "Right? I used to hang out here all the time when I was your age," Wilbur told him, grinning as he hopped up next to the boy. Holding on to the railing next to the door, Tommy leaned out so he could see the sky. Night had fallen long ago, and this far out from the lights of the town, Wilbur could see thousands of stars glittering against the expanse of black. "Whoa," Tommy breathed, his bright eyes going wide. I really like it out here. The further you get out from town, the better things are, Wilbur huffed, resting his hands behind him and leaning back. Tommy snorted, pulling himself back into the car and sitting down next to Wilbur. You could say that again. This place is a shithole. You don't even know the half of it, Wilbur told him, grinning when Tommy rested his head on Wilbur's shoulder. This town is terrible. It's so much better out in the rest of the world. Then why do you stay? Tommy asked, his voice softer than it had been before. Wilbur's breath puffed in front of his face in the cool night air. The stars twinkled above his head, and Wilbur imagined what it would be like to have wings. Large, dark wings that he could just use to fly towards the stars and never come back. I guess I've been staying for my dad, but I'm starting to realize he doesn't need me as much as I think he does, Wilbur admitted, dragging a hand through his hair. Wait, hold on. Okay, thank God, I thought for a second I didn't know if my mic was picking up. Hold on, is it the right mic? Okay, good. Phew. No Snapchat, I'm pretty sure. Never mind. Where was I? There was a beat between them, and Wilbur cracked another small smile as he glanced down at Tommy. Maybe when you turn 18, we'll just hop in my car and get the hell out of here. Tommy's face lit up at that. Really? Of course, Wilbur chuckled. You're my partner in crime, after all. Snickering, Tommy burrowed further into Wilbur's side. Resident crime boys, going on tour. That's gonna be us soon. The fondness inside of him burned like a low and steady flame as he pulled Tommy closer. Yeah, Toms, that's gonna be us soon. For the first time in a long time, Wilbur didn't taste any dirt when making a promise. By the time he got back into his car, his hair was plastered to his forehead and his jacket was soaked. He'd shielded the shoebox with his body and gently placed it on the passenger seat in the car. His chest ached. Everything ached, in all honesty. The yawning chasm inside of him was impossible to ignore now that he knew where it came from. Staring at the passenger seat of the car, Wilbur had to blink away tears burning in his eyes as more pieces of memories flashed through his mind. It was nothing as solid as the other two memories he'd seen, but he could picture Tommy sitting in the passenger seat of his car, blonde hair bouncing up and down as he sang loudly to the playlist Wilbur couldn't remember making. How did he meet Tommy? How long had they known each other for? They were close, that much was obvious. But how had this random kid seemingly wormed his way into every aspect of Wilbur's life? A glance at the clock told Wilbur he was going to be late for his shift if he didn't get a move on. His fingers were stiff as he forced himself to start the car. The unfamiliar playlist, now Wilbur knew he and Tommy had made it together, turned on again, and Wilbur couldn't bear to turn it off as he drove, despite the way it made his throat want to close up again. Drink break. A little while later, Wilbur found himself standing behind the counter at the diner, more flashes of memories trickling into his mind like sand from an hourglass. Tommy used to come into the diner a lot to mess with him while he worked. Wilbur would slip him free food whenever he could. If he gave Tommy French fries, though, it was an open invitation for Tommy to throw them at Wilbur's head. It hadn't been uncommon for him to get home and find a French fry hidden somewhere in his shirt. Still wearing the necklace, Wilbur found himself grabbing onto it without thinking every once in a while. He would rub his thumb against the metal of the crown, and somehow, it made his head feel clearer. Along with that, more flashes of memory seemed to pop up every time Wilbur did it, and he wasn't sure if that made him feel better or worse. The diner was bubbling with life like always. Patrons chatted at their booths, the cook kept calling out orders every few minutes. The rain outside was hitting the roof of the diner in an almost musical rhythm. The door chimed with a new customer, and a rock dropped into Wilbur's gut when he saw Techno and Puffy both walking for the breakfast bar. Both of them looked exhausted. Puffy's curly hair was a frizzy mess, while deep bags had settled themselves under Techno's eyes. There was also something haunted in both their faces, a darkness behind their eyes that Wilbur couldn't put a name to. It made him feel uneasy, so he grabbed the necklace again. The dread curling in his gut lessened just a bit. "Hey guys," Wilbur greeted, trying not to look worried as he glanced between them. "Coffee?" "Yes, please," Puffy said, with Techno nodding in agreement. Wilbur poured them both their coffees, sliding over the cream and sugars as well. "You both look like shit," Wilbur said after a moment, watching Puffy eagerly gulp down about half her coffee. I guess you could say we're in low spirits," Puffy explained quietly, tapping the side of her mug. "The coroner gave us the cause of death for the John Doe," Techno chimed in, running a hand down his face. "It was an accidental drowning. Nothing suspicious about it." A wave of nausea rolled over Wilbur at that. Tommy. They were talking about Tommy. He had drowned. So caught up in his lost memories, Wilbur had almost forgotten that at the crux of all of this, Tommy was dead. Or at least he was supposed to be. But that wasn't... No, he couldn't be dead. He had told Wilbur himself he wasn't dead. Those had just been dreams, though. What if that's all it was? Wilbur's subconscious could have been struggling to deal with the death of his friend, so it coped by creating strange dreams where Tommy claimed he was still alive. That didn't explain how Wilbur lost his memories in the first place, though. There was something more going on. Wilbur could feel it deep in his bones. "We still can't identify him," Techno was going on, forcing Wilbur to tune back into the conversation. "We checked with all the other nearby countries and no one recognizes him." Wilbur's jaw clenched. "Look, I can't explain how I know this, but his name is Tommy," Wilbur said to both of them without thinking. "He's 17 and he's from this town. It's hard to remember, but I think he was in foster care and it's just so sad," Puffy muttered, not even looking at Wilbur as he spoke. "Some kid drowns and no one knows who he is? He's gotta have someone out there looking for him. His poor parents must be losing their minds." Wilbur blinked. "Did you hear me? I said I know him. His name is Tommy." Neither Techno or Puffy reacted to him. Techno just shrugged and took a sip of his coffee. "It's bad luck all around. We'll probably have to reach out to the state to put his description up so someone can find him." Narrowing his eyes, Wilbur noticed that both Puffy and Techno's gazes seemed to look almost glazed over. Neither of them were focusing on him, instead murmuring to one another as they sipped at their drinks, as if Wilbur was completely invisible. Guys?" Suddenly, both of them looked up at him. "Wilbur? Were you saying something?" Techno asked, frowning at him. Wilbur's heart pounded in his chest as his mouth opened again. "Yeah, I was trying to tell you the kid isn't a John Doe. His name is Tommy." As soon as Wilbur mentioned the kid, it was as if a switch had been flipped. Both Puffy and Techno's eyes dropped from him, that glazed sheen returning as they seemed to forget about his existence in less than a second. "What the fuck?" Taking a step back from the counter, Wilbur looked between them both, wondering if this was what it felt like to have a building drop on top of you. They couldn't hear him. Whenever he brought up Tommy, it was like his words turned to static, and they both just tuned him out. That didn't make sense. This didn't make any sense at all. Digging into his pocket, Wilbur took out his phone and pulled up Phil's number. He had to try this with someone else. Hey, Dad? Remember the dead kid? Yeah, I know him. His name is Tommy. Wilbur pressed send on the message with trembling fingers. The blue sending bar appeared above the message, pausing when it got to the halfway part. Wilbur waited with blood roaring in his ears, and after a few seconds, a red alert symbol appeared next to his text. Message failed to send. Frowning, Wilbur tapped to try again. The same thing happened, resulting in a second failed message alert. Backspacing his other message, Wilbur typed up something else. Hey, Phil. That was it. No mention of Tommy, just a hello. He pressed send. The blue sending bar only appeared for a second before it went through, giving him a delivered notification underneath. Less than a minute later, 3 dots popped up, showing Phil was typing a response. Hey, Will, what's up? The dead kid, his name is Tommy. Message failed to send. I know who the dead kid is. Message failed to send. Did I ever mention someone named Tommy to you? Message failed to send. Tommy. Message failed to send. More dots popped up underneath all of Wilbur's failed message attempts. Will, you there? I can see you typing. Sighing, Wilbur typed up the first excuse he could think of. Sorry, my service is being a bit shit right now, so I was testing to see if it worked. Oh, okay, let me know if you need anything. Biting back a groan of frustration, Wilbur pocketed his phone again and noticed Techno and Puffy staring at him oddly. You alright, Will? Techno asked, raising an eyebrow. You look a bit upset. No, I'm not fucking alright. Anytime I try to say the name of my best friend who may or may not be dead, no one seems to be able to hear me. Instead of saying that, though, Wilbur schooled his expression into something more neutral. My phone is just being weird. Oh wait, no. My phone is just being weird. Wilbur lied. Like, broken? Puffy asked, furrowing her brows. Wilbur shook his head. Service is just spotty in here. A call from the cook behind him pulled Wilbur's attention away, and he gratefully took the out from Puffy and Techno both. As he put the dishes on the tray to deliver them to their designated table, he couldn't ignore the fear creeping up inside him like vines growing in his lungs. Something was wrong. That had become obvious to Wilbur when he realized that he'd forgotten his best friend, but now this only reaffirmed it. Wilbur had never been one to believe in the supernatural outside of getting a little creeped out from scary stories here and there. But there was nothing natural about that glazed over look both Techno and Puffy got any time Wilbur tried to say Tommy's name to them. Wilbur didn't try to talk to Techno or Puffy for the rest of their meal. Normally, Techno would push him to chat more, but he seemed distracted by his conversation with his coworker. Wilbur busied himself by wiping down tables far more than he needed to, and thankfully it wasn't long before Techno was dropping his money on the table and the two of them were heading out. The rest of his shift passed by in a blur. Whenever his head got too foggy, he'd grab the necklace again, and it would help his thoughts fall back in order. Still, it wasn't necessarily a good thing to have his thoughts in order, because this newfound clarity in his mind came with questions. Questions as to what the fuck was going on. Nothing about this was normal, and Wilbur felt like he was going to push himself to the edge of a breakdown if he focused on it too much. Eventually, his shift came to a blessed end. He got back in his car and blasted the songs that were far more familiar to him now than they were yesterday. He sang as he drove, despite the hollow feeling in his chest. Because if he sang loud enough, he could almost pretend like he could hear Tommy's voice singing along with him. If you focused on the road and didn't look in the passenger seat, he could imagine Tommy sitting there, singing right alongside him with a smile brighter than the sun. When he got back to his home, a part of him was tempted to bury himself under his blankets until he passed out so he could try to talk to Tommy again. But he wasn't tired yet, and he knew that he didn't dream if he took his anxiety meds, so it wasn't like he could just use those to make himself tired. This meant he was stuck following his nightly routine. It was so much worse now that he recognized the source of the emptiness that swallowed him inside his one-bedroom apartment. He was still missing a lot, but he could see flashes of Tommy sitting on the counter while Wilbur made dinner and trying to kick him as he moved around the kitchen. Or Tommy spreading himself out on the couch with a blanket wrapped around him like a burrito as he announced what movie they were going to watch tonight. From the bits and pieces that had filtered back into his mind so far, Wilbur remembered that Tommy had been in foster care. He had been orphaned at a young age and was moved between countless foster homes because of his difficult behavior. He had been 16 when he had been moved to Wilbur's town to stay with a foster family there, and was now on the verge of turning 18. Although there were gaps, Wilbur was able to put the pieces together well enough with what he had so far. From what he could tell, Tommy had practically lived with him. If his foster parents were that attentive, they likely wouldn't have been fine with the fact that Tommy spent more time with some random man in his 20s instead of with them. But since that hadn't been the case, he could only imagine that Tommy's home life wasn't a great one. From what Wilbur could tell, everyone's memories of Tommy had been erased following whatever happened to land him in the ocean. But even if they hadn't, Wilbur had a strange feeling he wouldn't be expecting Tommy's foster parents to go out of their way to look for him. As he was making himself dinner that night, Wilbur found himself setting out 2 bowls instead of 1 again by mistake. This time, though, he knew why he did that, and he had to squeeze his eyes shut and count his breathing for a few minutes before he was able to continue. Wilbur was wholly a stranger to grief. Sure, he had felt grief in a distant sense whenever he caught brief glimpses of the old photos of his mother Phil had buried in their garage, an ache forming inside of him that felt more like he was trying to replicate what he thought he should feel instead of actually feeling much about her at all. But it wasn't anything like this. At that moment, Wilbur felt like there was a black hole in his chest. He was caving in on himself, struggling to push air in and out of his lungs whenever he paused for a second too long. There was the small flickering of hope that kept sparking in the darkness whenever he remembered the dreams, but Wilbur didn't want to let himself feel that kind of hope. He didn't want to let that flame grow, because he had seen Tommy's dead body with his own eyes. Wilbur was in the middle of chewing his tasteless salad when Tommy's corpse flashed in his mind's eye once again. He ended up rushing to the bathroom, and by the time he got back to the kitchen, he had long since lost his appetite for dinner. Once he had cleaned up the remnants of his meal, Wilbur found himself sitting in front of the TV again, mourning how cold the empty space next to him was. A harsh buzzing from the table startled him out of his trance. Reaching forward, Wilbur grabbed his phone off the coffee table and almost cried with relief when he saw the contact name. "Hi, Nikki." "Hi, Will," Nikki greeted, her voice soft and tinged with something worried. "Are you okay? You sound upset." Wilbur almost snorted at how well she could read him. "I only said 2 words to you, and they sounded sad," Nikki emphasized. "Is something going on?" God, Wilbur wanted to tell her, but it wasn't like he could just explain everything about Tommy and the whole mystery of the entire town seemingly forgetting him to her. Hell, he didn't even think he could, considering what happened when he tried it with Puffy and Techno. "How so?" Nikki asked, and he heard shuffling on the other end that told Wilbur she was sitting down to give him her full attention. Sighing. Wait. Did I say the line that said, like, it's complicated? I can't remember. I'm just gonna keep going. Sighing, Wilbur dragged a hand down his face. He wanted to give her something, anything to get this weight off his chest. But he doubted whatever was suppressing the others from remembering Tommy would let him tell Nikki about him. This isn't about that question I asked you about that friend of yours, right? Nikki asked when Wilbur didn't respond. That made Wilbur freeze. Nikki had asked him about a new friend he'd made the last time they called. At the time, Wilbur couldn't remember Tommy, so he had no clue what she was talking about. But she must have been referring to him. How the hell did she remember him mentioning Tommy when Quackity had said Wilbur hadn't hung out with anyone in ages? Straightening up in his seat, Wilbur figured he might as well try. Actually, it kind of is. I think I might know who you're talking about now. Oh? Wilbur took a deep breath. Does the name Tommy ring any bells? There was a pause, then, sorry, you got really staticky there for a second. Can you repeat that? Shit. Electronic interference. Probably similar to whatever had made him unable to text Tommy's name to Phil. Slumping back into the couch, Wilbur brought his hand up to the necklace again, fiddling with it for a moment before absently biting the edge of it with his teeth. Maybe he shouldn't chew on a necklace he'd found in a shoebox in an abandoned train car, but he'd lost his fidget cube a few months back and it was helping his nerves. Will, can you repeat that again? Nikki pressed when Wilbur didn't respond. While Wilbur knew it was pointless, he decided to try again anyway. I asked if the name Tommy rang any bells. He asked, his words slightly slurred by the pendant. Nikki's response was immediate. Oh yeah, it was Tommy, Nikki said, and Wilbur nearly shot out of his seat. Do you guys still talk? Holy fuck. Nikki heard him say Tommy's name. She remembered him. The necklace fell from his lips and back onto his chest. Holy shit! You remember me mentioning Tommy? Nikki's response was distorted by static. Sorry, can't repeat that? Wilbur frowned, wondering how he'd gotten a moment of clear connection to say Tommy's name before, only to disappear just as fast. His eyes flickered down to the crown pendant resting on his sweater. When he had it in his mouth, next to the phone, Nikki had been able to hear him. Grabbing the pendant, Wilbur held it up next to the phone speaker. Is it better now? Nikki's voice came back loud and clear. Yeah, I can hear you. I asked if you and Tommy still talk. It was the necklace. That morning at the train car, Wilbur hadn't been able to remember anything until he put on the necklace. Now Nikki could only hear him talk about Tommy if he held the necklace up to the phone. Somehow, the necklace was able to counteract whatever the hell was keeping everyone from being able to remember Tommy. Holy shit. Will? You still there? Blinking back to attention, Wilbur realized he needed to figure out a way to answer her question. He didn't want to tell Nikki that Tommy was dead because right now Wilbur wasn't sure if that was completely accurate or not. Not to mention, Wilbur wasn't sure if he could find it in himself to actually say the words out loud, because saying it would make it real. The body Wilbur had found would no longer be some John Doe. It would be his Tommy. Wilbur wasn't sure if he was ready to confront that right now. We're talking a lot, actually. I don't know. I guess I don't think of Tommy as a new friend, because it feels like I've known him for so long, which is why I didn't realize you were talking about him the other night. Wilbur said, the words spilling out of him without thought. Oh, that's really good then. Are you too close? Yeah, Wilbur answered without thinking, letting muscle memory take over his conscious memories failed him. He's great, Nikki. He's funny as hell and loud to boot, but while sometimes people can get annoyed by him really easily, he's actually a great kid. He sounds so great, Will, Nikki giggled. You should bring him up next time you come visit. She paused for a beat. Or, when you move up here, if you ever get your fear of leaving your hometown. Wilbur clenched his jaw. While he wanted to open his mouth to deny that, a coldness settled over his shoulders, telling him it was true. For all his talk about how much he hated the town, there was also something about the idea of fully leaving that terrified him. But that wasn't his main problem right now. Yeah, that's where it gets complicated, he said instead, choosing to ignore Nikki's comment for now. Did you two have a falling out? Nikki asked, and he could perfectly imagine her gray eyes narrowing with worry. Not really, well, he's missing, is what Wilbur ended up settling for. Nikki let out a sharp gasp. Oh my god, I'm so sorry. How long has he been missing for? A few days, Wilbur said, eyeing the dull silver of the crown pendant. But I'm going to try and find him. Do you know where he is? Nikki questioned. Hold on. Was that my cat outside my door? 1 second. I thought I heard him meow. Nope, I must have just been hearing things. Do you know where he is? Nikki questioned. No, but I think I might know how to find out where he is, Wilbur explained, eyeing the clock on his wall and seeing that it was nearly midnight. He wasn't sure how much that time had passed. How that much time had passed, but he wasn't going to complain because it meant he was that much closer to talking to Tommy again. If you think you can find him, you should try, but make sure to stay safe, Wilbur, Nikki reminded him gently. Wrapping his fingers around the pendant, Wilbur nodded despite Nikki not being able to see it. I will. It didn't take long for Wilbur to fall asleep after he hung up his call with Nikki. He'd practically flung himself into bed after he'd finished talking to her, nestling himself under the blankets with the pendant resting securely on his chest. When Wilbur opened his eyes to see the beach in front of him, he could feel the cool metal of the necklace against his skin. Tommy was still there. He wasn't facing Wilbur this time, instead staring out towards the ocean, the water rushing around his jeans as a wave crashed onto the shore. This time, Wilbur noticed Tommy was a lot closer to the part of the shore where beach met forest. The trees loomed behind Tommy's head, but Wilbur couldn't bring himself to care when he had Tommy sitting right in front of him. Hey, Wilbur said softly, digging his fingers into the warm sand. Tommy whipped his head around, pale eyes going wide when he saw Wilbur sitting only a few feet away from him. Hi, he said cautiously, his voice rough. Sharp pain lanced through Wilbur's chest when he saw the deep sorrow in Tommy's eyes. His brows were furrowed and his knuckles were white where they gripped the edges of his sweatshirt. His silent question hung heavily in the salt-laden air between them as he gave Wilbur an expectant look. I went to the train car and found the shoebox like you told me to, Tommy, Wilbur told him, digging under his shirt and pulling out the necklace to show him. Tommy's eyes widened, then his expression crumpled. Wilbur, he sobbed, and Wilbur rushed forward to grab him as he broke down. Icy water wrapped around Wilbur's legs, but he paid it no mind as he grabbed Tommy and held him as close as he could. Once again, he was startled by how warm Tommy was, and buried his face in Tommy's hair as the boy cried into Wilbur's shoulder. I've missed you so fucking much. Tommy stuttered, his voice muffled by Wilbur's sweater. I've missed you too, Wilbur whispered, hugging Tommy as tightly as he could. The waves came and went. Wilbur let Tommy cry himself out, ignoring the way something inside of him tugged along every time the waves receded back into the ocean. In the distance, the forest continued to loom, and Wilbur wondered if the rustling leaves had always been that loud. After a few minutes, Tommy pulled back, but stayed pressed against Wilbur's side. So, do you remember everything again? Tommy asked in a weak voice. Wilbur sighed. I don't remember everything, but I know you're important to me. Wincing, Tommy took a shaky breath, but before forcing himself to nod. Yeah. Some people, well, sometimes people would even say we were like brothers. Brothers. The word lodged itself in Wilbur's throat, falling down into his chest and settling like a thorn in his heart. The title fit perfectly. It was exactly the word he'd been searching for when he wanted to tell Nikki what Tommy was like. The response slipped out of his mouth without thinking about it. Don't say that, I will cry, he said, repeating the mantra he knew he'd said dozens of times before. Whipping his head up, Tommy stared at Wilbur in shock. Wilbur gave him a small smile, and Tommy nodded with tears building in his eyes again. Before he could say anything, though, the waves washed over their legs again, and Tommy stiffened. Shit. Okay, I need to stop wasting time, Tommy said, shaking his head like he was shaking himself off. Wilbur, I'm not dead, okay? Wilbur clenched his jaw. I want to believe you, but I literally saw... He cut himself off, wincing at the thought of even saying the words out loud. Tommy, thankfully, knew what he was talking about. That's not me, he insisted, turning so he was facing Wilbur head-on, his gray-blue eyes boring into Wilbur's. I don't know what the fuck that thing you found is, but it's a fake body or some shit because I'm alive. I know I am. But how do you know that? Wilbur asked, furrowing his brows. Tommy frowned. He was silent for a moment, glancing around as if he was looking for something he could use to prove to Wilbur he was alive. Then, he was grabbing Wilbur's hand, and Wilbur startled as Tommy pressed his palm into his chest. My heart's beating, Will, Tommy told him, pressing his hand hard against his chest. You can feel it. And he was right. Wilbur could feel the steady thump, thump, thump under his palm. While Wilbur could just brush it off as the dream making him feel a heartbeat when there was none, well, Wilbur wanted to believe it was actually Tommy's heartbeat more than anything. There was more to it, though. It was strange. The longer he left his hand on Tommy's chest, the more he felt like he was digging his fingers into warm dirt. The rustling leaves from the forest had gotten louder. Okay, but if you're alive, then where are you? Wilbur asked, not moving his hand away from Tommy's chest. Tommy winced. He opened his mouth to say something, but no sound came out. Frown deepening, he tried again. I'm in the... He was cut off by a loud cough, and Wilbur felt it reverberate through his chest. You can't tell me, can you? Nodding, Tommy slumped forward so he was resting his forehead on Wilbur's shoulder. I don't think I can, but you know where I am, Will. It was the same thing Tommy had said in the first dream, that Wilbur knew where he was. Sighing, Wilbur wrapped an arm around Tommy to pull him close again. The wind grew stronger, and Wilbur buried his face into Tommy's hair. He took a deep breath to steady the pounding of his own heart when he recognized the smell Tommy was carrying on him. It was the smell of wet earth after a storm. Soft wildflowers blowing in the breeze. Something damp, natural, and full of life. The leaves from the forest rustled louder. Wilbur lifted his head again and the connections fell into place. I know where you are, Wilbur said, eyes darting between Tommy's face and the forest. I'm going to find you, okay? Do you promise? Tommy asked in a small voice. Gently resting a hand on the back of Tommy's neck, Wilbur leaned down to press their foreheads together. He squeezed his eyes shut, taking another deep breath and embracing the smell of grass after a rainstorm. I promise, Tommy. Next chapter. Summary. Chapter 4. Buried. Summary. Wilbur fulfills his promises. There's no trigger warnings, okay? Eyes flying open to stare at his plain white ceiling, Wilbur knew exactly where he needed to go. The forest. That's where Tommy was. Since that first morning where he'd found Tommy's body, the forest had been calling to him, watching him, waiting to see if he would figure out what secrets it held. Wilbur hadn't wanted to get near it, and even now the thought of going there made his heart leap into his throat. But none of that mattered. If he was right and Tommy was there, he was going to tear that whole fucking place apart to get him back. Wilbur didn't bother making himself coffee this time. He scrambled out of bed, not even bothering to check the time as he threw some clothes on and snatched his keys off the counter. Before he left, though, he grabbed his neck to make sure the necklace was still there. The metal was cool against his flushed hand. The crown pendant was a comforting weight, and Wilbur breathed a sigh of relief before stepping out of his front door. It was still raining from the day before. Fat, icy raindrops rolled down his sweater as he made his way through the parking lot into his car. The sky above his head was a rolling mess of dark gray clouds, and in the distance, Wilbur could see lightning flashing on the horizon. This storm was going to be a bad one. Hopefully he could get Tommy out before it hit. As he drove the familiar route to the forest, Wilbur picked up his phone with one hand and glanced at the screen briefly to pick out a familiar contact. He pressed the call button and held the phone up to his ear as he used his other hand to change lanes. Wilbur? Quackity's confused voice answered after a few rings. Quackity, hey man, glad you picked up. Wilbur started without preamble. I'm having a hard time remembering all those stories we used to tell each other about the forest. Can you remind me of them? Wilbur, what the fuck? It's like 10 in the morning. Why do you need to know about the forest? I can't really explain. I just need to remember what we used to say about it. Wilbur said, his heart pounding in his ears. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Quackity, please, Wilbur pleaded. That seemed to do the trick, because after another few beats, he heard Quackity sigh. Fine, but you owe me an explanation later, Soot, Quackity told him. I know I mentioned this the other day, but we used to say shit like if you went into the forest after dark and pissed off a certain tree, the ground would swallow you whole. Also, if you entered the forest a second time after pissing the tree off, it would mark you for death. Wilbur nodded. Yeah, I remember that. What was the stuff about connecting people? Quackity paused, and Wilbur could imagine his frown as he tried to remember the same story Wilbur could only vaguely recall. It was some shit like, if you enter the forest with someone else and only one of you comes out, the one left behind will show up in your dreams. Shit. That sounded familiar, alright. Was there anything else? Maybe like why the forest would try to eat people or whatever the fuck? Man, I don't fucking know, Quackity exclaimed. Will, seriously, why the hell do you need to know this stuff? Are you planning on taking a scary tour of the forest or something? Something like that, Wilbur said, already reaching for the hang up button. Thanks, Quackity, I owe you one. Wait, Will! Quackity's voice was cut off as Wilbur ended the call. While Wilbur still wasn't sure what exactly was going on with the forest and how it related to Tommy showing up in his dreams, it seemed like the stories they had passed around between sips of vodka as teenagers were more true than any of them originally thought. Excuse me. Wilbur thought about the whole being marked for death thing that came with a second visit to the forest. Maybe that should scare him. Maybe he was marked for death and if he entered the forest again, he wouldn't come out. But he couldn't bring himself. All he could think about was Tommy. About his best friend, his brother being trapped in there somehow. He had made a promise to find Tommy. Wilbur wasn't going to break that promise. As he turned off the highway and onto the dirt road that led to the forest parking lot, he brought a hand up to rub at the pendant again. It was then another memory flashed in his mind. Salt-laden wind whipped at his hair, making Wilbur curse under his breath as he struggled to light his cigarette. The sun had set long ago. Wilbur hadn't been able to sleep, so he'd found himself wandering to the beach to watch the waves until he got tired. The ocean's rhythmic roar and pull lulled him into a sense of calm he normally couldn't find. It quieted his mind, giving him space to breathe, just for a moment. As he finally got the flame to catch, he lit the cigarette, slumping down further against the sand as the familiar bitterness washed over his tongue. He watched the gray smoke curl up in small plumes in front of his face, reaching up to the twinkling stars above his head. Wilbur hated this town. Every second he spent here made him feel more and more like a stranger in his own skin. Like he was living past his own expiration date. Like he was supposed to leave long ago, but now he missed his time slot and was stuck in a state of perpetual limbo. But the stars. Wilbur would never tire of the stars here. Suddenly, there were shuffling footsteps behind him. Wilbur glanced to his left to see a teenager crouching down next to him. Hey man, mind if I bum one of those off of you? The teenager asked. He was young, probably only 16 or 17 at the most. Curly blonde hair was ruffled by the ocean breeze, and even in the dark gloom of night, Wilbur could see he had bright blue eyes illuminated by the moon above their heads. You're too young to be smoking, Wilbur told him, even though he'd picked up his own cigarette habit when he was 16. The boy scowled at that. Fuck off, I'm plenty old enough to smoke a damn cigarette. Wilbur huffed and shook his head. Trust me, kid, you don't want this habit. It's just a drain on your wallet and nothing good comes from it. Then why the hell do you do it? The boy asked, fully sitting down on the sand. Because I didn't have anyone to tell me not to when I was your age, Wilbur explained, taking another long drag and blowing it out towards the sea. Why do you want to smoke anyway? The only time I smoked when I was a kid was when I was hanging out with friends. The boy's scowl faded to something more akin to embarrassment, and he shrugged as he stared at the sand. I don't know. Just seems like something to do. A distraction. The kid wanted a distraction. Considering he was at the beach in the middle of the night, it wasn't out of left field for Wilbur to assume the kid was struggling with something. Maybe it was a fight he had with his parents. Maybe he got dumped. Or maybe he was just in one of those moods all teenagers get in, where it feels like you're being buried alive by the weight of all the expectations placed on your shoulders, and nothing you can say or do will stop the crushing pressure of time from suffocating you. Either way, Wilbur understood. He understood that feeling all too well. "I'm Wilbur. What's your name?" Wilbur asked, taking one last drag of his cigarette before stomping it out with his boot into the sand. The kid shrugged. "Tommy? Do your parents know you're out this late?" Tommy scowled again, and Wilbur wondered if that was his default expression. "They don't care where I am. I could stay out all night and they wouldn't say anything." Sympathy panged in his chest for Tommy, but at the same time, he was also worried at how easily he had given Wilbur, a complete stranger, the knowledge that no one was looking for him. "You shouldn't tell strangers that," Wilbur told him, folding his hands in front of him. "Don't they teach you stranger danger shit like that in school?" Tommy snorted. "If you want to try and kidnap me, you can, but I'll fucking bite you." Wilbur let out a startled laugh at this. "The fuck are you, a raccoon?" "Maybe," Tommy shot back, a genuine smile flickering over his face now. "For all you know, I could have rabies." More laughter rattled through Wilbur's chest again, and he tried to remember the last time someone had made him laugh like that. "How about instead of you giving me rabies, we walk down to the corner store over there where there are more people around, and I'll buy you a can of soda or something," Wilbur offered. Tommy frowned, suspicion suddenly clouding his gaze. "Why?" "Because you look like you need a distraction, and I think I could use one too," Wilbur explained, pushing to his feet. He held a hand out towards Tommy, a silent offer. Tommy stared at the hand for a moment. Then he took it, and that was that. Wilbur reached the forest parking lot with the taste of that cigarette still lingering in his mouth. He remembered that after they'd left the beach, the two had gone to the corner store and Wilbur had bought them both snacks. They'd sat at one of the benches outside the store, drinking and eating while they chatted about their lives. They'd gone their separate ways after that, but the very next day, Tommy had waltzed right into the diner, eyes going wide when he saw Wilbur behind the counter. After that, he'd made it a point to come into the diner regularly to bother Wilbur during his shifts. But it wasn't exactly bothersome because Wilbur had looked forward to chatting with Tommy while he worked. From there, the rest was history. Staring at the forest through his car windshield, Wilbur could feel that same tugging feeling in his chest he'd felt before. Something was pulling him towards the trees and their shadows. Something wanted him to go inside, to let himself be swallowed by the darkness. The pendant was warm against his chest, although looking at the forest head-on made the fog return to his mind. Holding on to the pendant helped clear it away once more. Wilbur climbed out of the car. He stopped fighting against the tugging, instead letting his feet lead him away from the parking lot and towards a dirt path that led into the trees. Raindrops were still falling against his head, plastering his hair to his forehead and soaking his sweater until the fabric clung uncomfortably to his body. When he stepped onto the dirt path, the smell of wet earth filled his nose again, just like when he had hugged Tommy in the dream. Ignoring the anxiety racing through his veins like electricity, Wilbur let himself be pulled into the forest. The forest itself wasn't as ominous on the inside as it seemed from the outside. Spindly tree branches covered in bushy dark leaves sheltered Wilbur from the worst of the rain. His boots squished against damp leaves, and pale light from the clouds above filtered in from the canopy above his head. The tugging in his chest urged him to go deeper. He reached the end of the main trail, but kept walking anyway. Thorny bushes caught his pant legs, but he kept walking, refusing to turn around because he was getting closer. He could feel it. It was like there was an invisible string tied around his chest, one that had been pulling on him for the past week, and now it was finally starting to go slack. The pressure was lessening, and Wilbur kept a firm grip on the pendant in his hand as the forest around him got darker and darker. Leaves rustled in the wind like whispers he wasn't supposed to hear. If Wilbur didn't focus too much on the sounds, he could have sworn the breeze actually sounded like real voices. Incoherent, breathy voices that seemed to be asking him something. Begging him, even. As the invisible string got more and more slack, Wilbur remembered the last time he'd been in this forest. "Wilbur, come on! We gotta go further in!" Tommy yelled, hopping between the bushes and ducking under tree branches. "I still don't understand why we're in here," Wilbur said, frowning as he narrowly avoided getting smacked in the face with another branch. "I told you this place creeps me out." "Well, it doesn't creep me out," Tommy declared with a wide grin. "I don't know how to explain it, Will, but it wants me here. I can feel it." "Maybe that's not a good thing?" Wilbur suggested, trying to keep his voice level even as his heart rate picked up. He didn't believe in all those scary stories about the forest. They were just folk tales made up to scare the freshmen. It was ridiculous for him to be nervous about being in the forest, but unease itched at his skin. This place was wrong. "Tommy, I think we should head back," Wilbur called out, noticing Tommy was far ahead of him now. "Stop being such a pussy, Wilbur," Tommy teased, jumping onto the large tentacle-like roots of a gnarled oak tree. "This place is awesome!" Wilbur clenched his jaw. "Tommy, please, we need to go." Tommy huffed and hopped off the tree roots. If you're gonna be such a big baby, then just stay here. Then just stay there." "No, I'm not leaving you alone in here," Wilbur argued, taking another step through the bushes. "Relax, I see a clearing up ahead. I'm just gonna go check it out and I'll be right back," Tommy reassured him. Before Wilbur could protest this, Tommy was already sprinting ahead, disappearing into the shadows between the tree trunks. Wilbur, who was panting from trying to avoid stepping into thorny bushes, frowned and kept trudging forward. He reached the oak tree, leaning against the trunk to take a breather as he searched for Tommy's bright golden hair in the distance. He could distantly hear Tommy's laughter and the sound of branches being crushed under shoes. Listening to the sounds of Tommy running ahead, Wilbur tried to remind himself it was okay. It was just a forest. Nothing more, nothing less. As long as Tommy didn't get attacked by a goddamn wolf or something, they'd be fine. Suddenly, there was a scream. "Wilbur!" Tommy shouted. It wasn't the joyous or teasing shouts Tommy had been yelling out before. No, this time Tommy's voice was edged with panic. Pure, unfiltered panic. "Tommy!" Wilbur yelled back, pushing off the tree and running in the direction Tommy had disappeared in. "Where are you?" "I'm over here!" Tommy called, his voice echoing between the trees. "Help! It's fucking got me! I'm coming, Tommy!" Wilbur shouted, running through the trees as fast as he could. His heart was pounding in his ears, his lungs were burning, and branches whipped across his face. He could taste blood on his tongue, and his panic was so encompassing, it was like a vice had wrapped around his chest. "Wilbur, please!" Tommy's cries were getting muffled now, and Wilbur's head was spinning as he tried to figure out where his voice was coming from. It was like Tommy's voice was being echoed in the wind. He sounded like he was to Wilbur's right, but also behind him, but also in front of him. Wilbur whipped his head around, trying to figure out where the hell Tommy had gone. "Tommy! Where are you? Help!" Tommy shouted again, this time from Wilbur's left. "It's going to—" He was cut off mid-sentence. Wilbur's heart dropped into his stomach. "Tommy?" Wilbur shouted, moving to the left. Somehow, it was as if the forest had gotten darker, the branches hanging lower than they had before. "Tommy? Where are you?" There was no response. Wilbur ran face first into a low-hanging branch. He yelped when he felt it cut across his cheek, and when he brought his hand up to his face, he could see there was blood on his fingertips. Shit, where the hell was he? Wilbur's head whipped around, trying to figure out what direction he was going in. He needed to find where he went. He needed to find... Wait, who was he looking for? Pausing, Wilbur frowned as he stared at his hands, eyeing the blood smeared across his palms. He'd been looking for someone. He had come to the forest with someone, and now they were gone, and he was... The fog descended on his mind like a blanket. It wrapped his thoughts in cotton, slowing him down until he was struggling to remember how he'd even gotten to the forest in the first place. He wasn't supposed to be here. Why the hell had he come here again? Wilbur caught his breath, twisting his fingers in his hair as he tried to think of why he'd come to the forest. He hated the forest. Always had. It made no sense for him to be here. He should leave, before something bad happened. In a daze, Wilbur turned and headed back in the direction of the dirt path. There was something nagging in the back of his mind, telling him that he was forgetting something important. But the harder he tried to focus on what he was missing, the quicker his thoughts slipped between his fingers. It was like trying to grab water, an impossible task that just made him more and more frustrated the more he went on. That night, Wilbur would drive home to his apartment in a haze. He would pass out in bed and wake up early the next morning before the sun rose. When he got up to make himself coffee, he would have the strangest urge to watch the sunrise at the beach. Stopping in his tracks, Wilbur gasped as the memories flashed through his mind. That next morning was when he found Tommy's body. Something had been telling him to go to the beach, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized it had been telling him to go to the forest. Wilbur's subconscious had been trying to get him to go back for Tommy this whole time. Wilbur had just been too stupid to realize it until now. Well, I'm back now, Wilbur whispered, and he wasn't sure who he was speaking to. Was it to the wind still whispering pleas in his ears? Was it to Tommy, who he could just feel was somewhere nearby? Or was it to the forest itself, telling it that its plan hadn't worked? Wilbur had come back for Tommy, and he wouldn't be leaving without his little brother. Maybe it was to all three. Or maybe Wilbur was just talking to himself. He really wasn't sure anymore. He kept walking. It was strange. Wilbur could feel the forest trying to make the fog descend over his mind. His thoughts kept bouncing around in strange directions, urging him to go back the way he came, to question why he was doing this when he already hated the forest so much. But then he'd squeeze the pendant, and Tommy's face would flash in his mind again. He was here for Tommy. That was the one thing he couldn't forget. He promised. Soon, Wilbur could see the gnarled oak tree from before, the one that teenagers had always said was cursed, the one Tommy had jumped on before running off towards the clearing, only to disappear into thin air. The tugging stopped. The invisible string fell to the ground, leaving Wilbur without any sense for where he should go from here. Lay down, the wind whispered into his ears. Rest your eyes. Strangely enough, Wilbur's eyes were growing heavy the longer he stood in the forest. Kneeling down, he pressed his hand against the moss and dirt and felt a steady thump, thump, thump against his palm. Tommy's heartbeat. Tommy was nearby, and if Wilbur wanted to find out where he was probably going to have to talk to him again. Although he was nervous that if he fell asleep here, he'd be swallowed by the moss and dirt and never come up for air, the pendant clutched in his hand helped calm his racing heart. The crown would keep him safe. He had to trust that, because he was at a dead end, and something was pulling his limbs down, 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 begging him to close his eyes and sleep. Resting his head on the soft moss, Wilbur ran his fingers over the warm metal of the pendant. A few scattered raindrops made it through the canopy of leaves above him, and Wilbur fell asleep to the cool drops hitting his cheeks. Wilbur opened his eyes, and he was back on the beach. They were right next to the border between the sand and the dirt of the forest now. Tommy was still sitting in the waves, but Wilbur could see other things about him now that he hadn't been able to see before. There was dirt streaked across his cheeks and caked under his nails. Hold on, why is it saying reconnecting to chat? Oh, phew. The Wi-Fi must have gone out for a second. Are we good? Stream okay? Okay, I think stream is fine. There was dirt streaked across his cheeks and caked under his nails. Delicate, springy flowers were blooming from his arms and hair. When he let out a shaky breath, Wilbur could hear leaves rustle in time with it. "How do I find you?" Wilbur asked, grabbing Tommy by the shoulders and turning him to meet his eyes. "You're literally so fucking close. I can feel you, Will," Tommy told him, grabbing his wrists with his dirt-covered hands. "You just gotta listen for me." Wilbur put a hand on Tommy's chest, feeling the steady thump, thump, thump of his heart. "I'm not going to leave you there again," Wilbur said, already feeling himself being tugged back to the waking world. Tommy squeezed his hand. "I believe you. Now hurry up and get me out of here." The waves rushed over their legs again. The water was ice cold. Wilbur woke up with a gasp. He bolted upright, feeling weeds and flowers rip off his arms from where they'd been wrapping around him while he slept. The sky above his head was dark now. His clothes were soaked and he was shivering violently. The rain was still coming down in buckets, and now the wind was no longer a gentle whisper in his ears. Instead, the wind was now howling, blowing the warmth straight out of him with a vengeance. He pressed his hand against the dirt again. Sure enough, there was still the steady thump, thump, thump underneath the moss and earth. Stumbling to his feet, Wilbur ignored the wind pulling at him, screaming at him to lay down again and let the moss swallow him whole. The necklace was burning hot in his hand now, and he gripped it tightly, letting the pain keep him focused. Wilbur rushed over to the oak tree. There was a patch of wildflowers leading away from the tentacle roots, trailing down the way Tommy had disappeared. Wilbur followed the wildflowers like a path, the heartbeat growing louder in his ears with every step. Finally, he found the clearing. The trees opened up into a dark meadow, with a single tree that looked like it had fallen over decades ago. Moss climbed up the trunk, invading it like a parasite, rotting away the wood until it was pocketed with holes. Stepping out from under the canopy of the trees, more fat raindrops poured down on him. His clothes were already soaked through, so he barely noticed as he knelt down in front of the tree trunk, noticing a strange patch where the pink and yellow wildflowers clustered in front of it. Pressing his hand down on the earth, the heartbeat was louder than ever before. So Wilbur did the only thing he could do. He began to dig. He dug his shaking hands into the warm, wet earth and pulled it out clump by clump. Wildflowers scattered the ground around him like corpses, covered with dirt where Wilbur had ripped them out by the roots. The wind picked up around him. The howling was so loud he could barely hear himself think. It didn't like what he was doing and was screaming at him to stop. But Wilbur didn't listen to it. Whenever the fog started to creep into the edges of his mind, he gripped the necklace again, and the burning against his palm cleared his head enough for him to continue. He dug. He dug and he dug and he dug. His hands were nearly black with how much dirt was on them. His sweater had been gold, but now it was a putrid shade of yellow-brown. It didn't matter. He had to keep digging. His arms ached. His breath was coming out in ragged puffs, but finally, he got a glimpse of something that wasn't just dirt. Bright blue fabric. It was stained by dirt, but Wilbur recognized the sweatshirt Tommy had been wearing that night. He yanked more dirt up. There was one of Tommy's hands, pale and strangely warm, just like it had been in the dream. "Tommy?" Wilbur asked as he continued to rip up the dirt by where he guessed Tommy's head was. "Tommy, can you hear me?" He ripped away more flowers, and finally, Tommy's face came into view. His cheeks were streaked with mud and dirt covered his eyes. But it was him. "Tommy," Wilbur breathed, reaching a mud-covered hand down to touch Tommy's cheek. "Wake up, Toms. You need to get up." For several heart-pounding seconds, Tommy didn't move. Was he dead? Was Wilbur too late and Tommy had suffocated in the forest? But before his panic could well up inside of him too much, Tommy's eyes flew open and he lurched upright with a gasp. Wilbur yanked him out of the rest of his burial mound as Tommy began to cough up large clods of dirt. He patted Tommy's back, his heart racing in his ears almost as loudly as the wind howling around them. "It's okay," Wilbur reassured him as he hacked up all the dirt in his lungs. "I've got you. I'm right here." Relief flooded through Wilbur, and it was the sweetest thing he thought he'd ever felt. Tommy was alive. He was alive. He was breathing, and now he was back in Wilbur's arms. His little brother was okay. After nearly a minute of coughing, Tommy finally sucked in a huge gulp of air. When he looked up at Wilbur, his eyes were a brighter shade of blue than Wilbur ever remembered them being. "You found me," Tommy whispered in a hoarse voice. "I promised you, didn't I?" There was a beat of silence as Tommy stared at him in shock. Then he was lunging forward, wrapping his arms around Wilbur's chest, and Wilbur almost laughed as he hugged Tommy back. Wilbur wanted to cry. He actually did end up shedding a few tears as he pulled his little brother close, murmuring, "I'm sorry," over and over again as Tommy sobbed into his shirt. They were both covered in mud. The rain was still coming down in buckets on top of their heads. Tommy shivered and curled closer to Wilbur, and Wilbur wrapped him in his arms as best as he could. Suddenly, there was a deafening crack in the sky, and Wilbur glanced up right as lightning struck one of the trees in the forest not too far from them. Both him and Tommy winced and covered their ears, while the howling wind only got louder. "We need to leave," Wilbur said, already struggling to his feet. He pulled Tommy up with him, and Tommy nearly fell over when he put weight on his legs. Wilbur wrapped an arm around him to hold him upright, and Tommy grimaced as he straightened up. "Fucking hell, you get buried alive for a week and suddenly you can't fucking walk," Tommy complained, shaking his head. "We can worry about that later. I think we need to get the fuck out of here," Wilbur said, having to shout to be heard over the rain. The pendant was practically burning a hole through Wilbur's shirt now as he dragged Tommy out of the clearing. The wind screamed in his ears, and this time he was able to hear exactly what it was telling him. "You can't take him from us!" "Oh yes I fucking can!" Wilbur shouted back, barely ducking in time as a stray branch flew right over his head. They stumbled back into the trees together. It was even worse there, with the wind rattling every single tree branch and things flying around them almost like they were in a tornado. Wilbur dragged Tommy back towards the gnarled oak tree, and Wilbur could feel it watching him as the pendant got impossibly hotter. Stopping in front of the tree, Wilbur kept Tommy tucked under his arm with one hand, while he used the other to yank the pendant off. "You want something? Then take this!" he yelled at the oak tree. He chucked the necklace into the tangle of the roots and watched it disappear into the shadowy depths in seconds. The wind grew louder, but the fog didn't encroach on his mind again. "Let's go, Tommy," Wilbur said, trying to yank him away from the oak tree. "Why the fuck are you talking to the tree?" Tommy yelled as he stumbled after Wilbur, regaining more of his strength with every second. "Because the tree wants you and I'm not letting it have you," Wilbur shouted back. Tommy's eyes widened as he stared at the tree for a moment. Then he pressed himself against Wilbur again and didn't fight when Wilbur tugged him back towards the path. The two sprinted down the dirt path, and Wilbur could hear trees crashing down behind them. The necklace might have been enough not to lose his memories again. But the forest had claimed Tommy, and it was pissed it couldn't have him. Wilbur didn't give a shit. He was done giving a shit about the forest. Hell, he was done giving a shit about this entire town. With screaming muscles and aching lungs, the two finally made it out of the forest. Wilbur could see the storm was everywhere now, blowing leaves and branches around the parking lot, and looking out onto the ocean showed Wilbur a wall of darkness only lit up by the occasional lightning strike over the water. Tommy hopped into the passenger seat of the car while Wilbur jumped behind the wheel. They were both filthy, and his car was definitely going to be stained after this, but he didn't care. He just turned on the engine and peeled out of the parking lot at a speed that was definitely illegal, and turned onto the highway without a second thought. Rain pounded on the windshield. Wilbur turned on the wipers and pressed down on the gas. He wanted to get away from the forest as fast as possible. A few minutes passed in silence, both Wilbur and Tommy just panting to catch their breath. When Wilbur realized Tommy was shivering, he turned on the heating full blast, and they both sighed in relief as warmth filled the air. Finally, after a few minutes of driving, Tommy frowned. "Why aren't we going to your place?" Tommy asked, noticing when Wilbur missed his usual highway exit. Wilbur huffed out a bitter laugh. "I'm fucking done with this town. Aren't you?" Tommy gulped and glanced behind them. Through the back windshield, Wilbur could see the dark storm clouds circling above the town. The forest was angry that Tommy had been taken from it, and it seemed like it was going to take its wrath out on the town. Wilbur didn't care. Maybe he should have cared, but he couldn't bring himself to anymore. He was sick of that place. He was sick of the diner, he was sick of his apartment, and he was sick of trying to fit himself into a life he didn't want. That town was a coffin for Wilbur, and it would have been a coffin for Tommy too if he stayed there. Wilbur had been afraid of leaving before, afraid of change and how it could all go wrong. But he was done being afraid of that type of shit. He had Tommy back, and that was all he needed now. "Yeah," Tommy finally agreed after a minute, his voice strangely soft. "I'm done with this place." They passed the sign telling them they were at the town limit. Wilbur blasted by without a second thought, only speeding up as he left his hometown behind him. Phil could take care of himself. That had always been the problem between them, actually. Wilbur needed Phil more than Phil needed him, even if he never wanted to admit it to himself. But now, Wilbur was ready to properly leave the nest. After all, if he ever saw that forest again, he might have a full-on mental breakdown. The silence was deafening between him and Tommy, so Wilbur turned up the radio just to see what was going on. "Massive hurricane heading our way. Board your windows and expect severe damage." Wilbur turned off the radio just as fast. He didn't miss the way Tommy shrunk down in his seat at the announcement. Picking up his phone with one hand, Wilbur went to his recent calls and pressed the one he was looking for. Putting the phone on speaker, Tommy frowned as it rang, and Wilbur gave him a reassuring look. "Hey, Will. How are you doing?" Nikki answered immediately. Wilbur smiled at the sound of her voice. "I'm doing great, actually." Nikki paused for a moment, seemingly surprised. "Oh, really? Did you find—" "I found him," Wilbur finished for her. "He's safe with me, and I was actually wondering if I could take you up on that offer to stay with you now." "Tonight?" Nikki asked, the confusion evident in her tone. "Yup, it's a bit last minute, but we wanted to get out of town fast," Wilbur explained, eyeing the lightning flashing behind them. "Is that okay?" "Oh yeah, that's totally fine. Are you driving up?" "Yeah, so it'll take us a few hours to get there." Nikki laughed, and it was one of the nicest things Wilbur had heard in days. Of course that's fine. I'll have everything made up for you both when you get here. Thank you, Nikki, Wilbur said. No, thank you, Nikki, Wilbur said, trying to inject as much sincerity into his voice as he could while warmth flooded his chest. It's no problem, Will. I'm excited to meet Tommy. There was no static anymore, and Wilbur breathed a sigh of relief. I can't wait for you guys to meet too, Wilbur said, glancing at Tommy, who was staring at him with wide eyes. I'm gonna go now, but I'll see you soon. Drive safe, Will! And with that, he hung up and put his phone back in his pocket. Nikki's an old friend of mine, Wilbur explained softly to Tommy. She's really nice, and she has a little brother around your age. I think you guys would get along. Tommy glanced back at the town that was growing smaller and smaller behind them. He pursed his lips, blinking a few times as he rubbed more dirt out of his eyes. After a few beats of silence, he nodded. Okay. I trust you, Wilbur. Wilbur flashed him a smile. You better, he teased gently. You're my partner in crime, after all. Tommy's smile was weak, but the fact that it was there at all was more than enough for Wilbur. Crime boys on tour. Crime boys on tour, Wilbur repeated, turning back to face the road. With that, Tommy laid his head down on the center console of the car. Wilbur reached over and started carting his fingers through Tommy's hair absent-mindedly, gently trying to get the dirt chunks out where he could. At one point, his finger ran across something that wasn't dirt, but also wasn't hair. Glancing down, Wilbur could see a small white flower blooming from Tommy's head, and he wondered if Tommy knew about it. Wilbur decided not to say anything. That was something they could deal with another day. They had all the time in the world now, after all. Right, so I know I didn't give a lot of answers for what was going on, and that was intentional as the author. I know what went down fully, but I couldn't really fit it in a good place for Tommy and Wilbur to find out in a way that felt natural. I hope you guys don't mind, but if you do want to know explanations, wow. Whew. Sorry, I needed to stretch. Man, that was good. I love Bones and the Beast. Such a great writer. Oh geez, but now I'm a bit lightheaded. And during that bit where he was like digging Tommy up in the forest, my hands started like, do you know that feeling like that you get usually in your feet when they fall asleep? That tingling feeling is happening in my hands. Things like that only happen in places other than my foot when when I'm anxious. Man. Phew. That was fun. Alright. I think I am going to end the stream there. This is really fun. Be sure to support Bones and the Bees. I think Bones and the Bees is same at on Twitter. Hold on, let me look. Bones and the Bees. Oh, yep. Go follow Bones and the Bees on Twitter. Oh wow, they just passed 6.5. Oh, she's just passed 6.5k. That's really cool. Alright, but in the meantime, who shall we raid? I might just end it, not raid anybody. Alright. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you're new to my stream, be sure to leave a follow, and go follow my other socials. Just hit !! socials in the chat, and something should pop up. I don't know what I'm gonna stream, but I'm probably gonna stream... God. I don't know when I'm gonna stream next, actually. Because I can't stream tomorrow or Friday. Saturday, I don't know. We'll see. Alright. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye!